Hi there, I'm Dave Webster, pastor at Arbroath Mission. I want to ask you this question. London, Bristol, um, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Atlanta, what do these and many other cities have in common? They've all been places where there have been protests over the last week or so. Some protests have been peaceful, some protests have been, have turned violent, some have had counter protests, some have involved statues being taken down or graffiti being put up. But there's been all these protests going on, and lots of discussion has been generated about how people protest or why people protest, and it's been going on particularly on social media. And sports people in the United States have been asked this question by the media saying, are you going to, when the season starts, you're going to take a knee to show solidarity with protesters? Politicians in the UK have been asked that question, and that's the sort of the key question. What will you do? And that's being posed to people. And that's an interesting question when that's been asked towards a public figure, someone who's sort of important in our society. And I'm therefore, and I think, a lot of us are interested in the response with that. So what would they do? Well, actually, I think there's a far more interesting question, which is, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus stand in solidarity with protesters? What would Jesus do? Um, that to me is a far more interesting question. What would Jesus do? And this is a great question to ask about a whole number of different things that we can come across in life. What would Jesus do? But it isn't actually always straightforward to think about what would Jesus do when we apply that question to our a complex situation in our kind of present day world. It's not always straightforward because Jesus often took a course of action that surprised people. For instance, if he was asked a question, like for instance when he was asked about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus didn't take either of the choices that he was offered. He actually gave a response that brought deeper thinking to the issue. And so it's not always easy to think, what would Jesus do, and to know the exact answer with that. In terms of the question then that we're thinking about there, what would Jesus do in relation to, how would Jesus protest? Would Jesus protest? What would he do? Then maybe there's perhaps the best thing to do is to ask another question and just come at it from that angle. How did Jesus protest? Let's look at the Bible and actually say, well, rather than just thinking about in the present day and parachuting Jesus into that, let's look at the Bible and say, if we're interested in Jesus, what his attitude, what his thoughts would be on all of this, let's go back and see how Jesus acted in the Bible, and maybe we can learn from that. So Jesus, we're thinking about this because Jesus is the Son of God. The Bible teaches he is someone that we want to listen to, we want to learn from. But in addition to being the Son of God, Jesus was also, of course, born and raised and lived as a Jewish man, fulfilling all the requirements of the Jewish law and adhering to the commands of the Hebrew Scriptures. So, he lived rightly and properly as a person within his time and culture. But Jesus also protested about things that he saw that were wrong within that Jewish culture. And he often did this simply by his actions. For example, whilst Jewish religious culture it had built up a whole tradition based around ceremonial hand washing and precise lists of do's and do nots on the Sabbath day of rest and other things like that. And Jesus protested against these burdensome restrictions that were placed upon people by their sort of religious advisors by simply ignoring them. And on some occasions he actually pointed out the hypocrisy of those who were imposing those additional religious rules upon people. But he just cut across things by just ignoring these conventions that were expected to be followed. And Jesus also chose to protest on occasion by setting his own example. For example, in the culture in the day in which Jesus lived, where women were not valued and given the same dignity as men, Jesus chose to welcome women as being part of his wider group of disciples who travelled with him in addition to his 12 disciples. And he encouraged them in learning from his teaching. And that's something that was not done in those days. And in addition to this, Jesus also welcomed children into his presence in a culture where children were seen as a distraction and in a large way unimportant. Jesus went against that by simply by his actions in welcoming children and making time for them in the midst of all that he was doing. So living out what you believe in and not taking part in things that you disagree with. These are two very simple things that Jesus did to peacefully and quietly protest against the way that things were done by others. And yet at the same time, there are ways to make a significant point to those who are around you. Quiet actions can sometimes make a loud point. Quiet actions, and simply by the things that you choose to do and not to do, they can make a loud point. But at the same time, not all of Jesus' protests were so quietly made. And I want to think about one in particular. This is perhaps the most famous, most well-known protest that Jesus is ever known to have made. And we find it in the Bible. It's actually in all four of the Gospels. We know it as the clearing of the temple. And that's what it would be headed up as in a lot of your Bibles, if you've got one, if you're looking that up. But if you want to look it up, you'll find it in Matthew chapter 21. You'll find it in Mark chapter 11. You'll find it in Luke chapter 19. And you'll find it in John chapter 2. Although several scholars think that the incident recorded in John chapter 2 is actually a separate recorded historical incident where Jesus was also involved in clearing the temple at that time, at that stage. So anyway, you can look that up. You can go and read the four. You can go and read the four accounts there. But let me just set the scene for you. Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem. He's been welcomed in by the crowds at Passover at the start of the Passover week, and they've been waving palm branches and they've been throwing their cloaks down on the road and just to welcome him. And what he's done is he's now come into the temple precincts and he's surveying the landscape there round about him. And in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 11, we're told that Jesus took a good look around at everything. He looked all around at it, and then it was getting towards the end of the day and he went back to his lodgings. He went back to where he was staying for the night. And what Jesus would have seen when he looked around there was this massive enclosed area on the Temple Mount, just this huge area there, just big flat area that was sort of closed off, walls round about it. And in the middle of that was the temple building that was only accessed through a series of gates and courtyards, and I won't go into what all the kind of courtyards and gates were for, but it was all significant. It was all part of the temple worship there. But let's just focus on this sort of wide enclosed area round about for the moment. The temple and this whole area there, it was a place of pilgrimage, and they needed a lot of space there because a lot of people would come and just mingle around and be there at the temple. For Jewish people who had been dispersed to different countries, different parts, they would come back to the temple as a place of worship, a place to worship God and a place to offer sacrifices to him. And as part of that, to sort of service this need, then there was a need for animals and other items that pilgrims would need to purchase for their the sacrifices they wanted to offer. They weren't necessarily going to bring all of that with them, and they needed that on site, on location. And so within the Temple Mount, within this enclosed area, there was a sort of a marketplace had developed where people bought the things that they needed. And also there was a temple currency that was used within the temple grounds. So you had to change your money and use temple money, temple currency, in order to buy things on location there. And so that was all going on there, and there was also therefore kind of money changers that were prevalent within this Temple Mount as well, just to service the need there. So if we read on in Mark's Gospel and we follow along the Gospel narrative there, we find that Jesus sees all of this and he's not happy with it. Jesus is not happy with this. Again, you can go and read this in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John's Gospel. All got sort of a lens into what's going on here. And what we find is that as Jesus enters the temple, in Mark's Gospel it says that he's gone home for the night and he's come back the next day. So he's come back here, and it says, and I'll read this from Matthew 21 in this occasion, he drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. So I don't know if you didn't expect that, if you weren't aware of this, if you didn't know this story, that's something that you didn't expect, the kind of thing that Jesus would do. Well, he did it. I'll read it again. What did Jesus do when he went in, having seen all of this and coming in the next day? What did Jesus do? He drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. I mean, this is not a silent action. This is not just, just looking on at things. He's stepping right in there and taking action. And I always remember my RE teacher from school, and she was telling us about this story from the Bible, and she painted this very vivid image for us of Jesus along with 12 sort of strapping, well-built disciples with him, all kind of just crashing around with baseball bats, tipping over all these tables. And that image has sort of stuck in my mind since she spoke about that. And maybe that image that she gives, crashing around with baseball bats or the equivalent, is a bit of an over-dramatization. But at the same time, if you read in John chapter 2, you find there that Jesus made a whip with cords in order to drive out the cattle, the sheep, and all the kind of livestock that were there for people to buy for their sacrifices, and he overturned the money changers' tables, and you can imagine all the as the tables are flipped over, the money going flying, and the cages of doves being pushed aside and maybe breaking open, and doves flying off, and you can imagine that there would be a bit of a hullabaloo, a bit of a scene, a bit of carnage going on there. And so that's what happens. That's what Jesus does. But why does he do it? Why does Jesus do that? Why does he sort of flip the lid there? What's going on? Well, Jesus explains his actions. He quotes from the Old Testament. We'll read this from Mark 11, verse 17. And Jesus says this, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." You see, people were coming to worship at the temple, but in the process they were being fleeced by unscrupulous traders who were just looking to make a financial killing at other people's expense. And this just stood in antithetical opposition to the purpose, that the nature of what the temple was meant to be. The temple was meant to be about people coming and giving to God in worship. But in fact, here you had these traders who were just seeking to make a daylight robbery of people and taking from them. And Jesus was not prepared to stand for this. Jesus was just not prepared to stand for this. Now, in Mark's Gospel, it goes on to record that the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this. They saw what Jesus was doing, and they began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So that's what goes on. That's sort of the impact of what Jesus has done in the response of some people towards it. Of what I'd like to do, though, having sort of outlined that story, having set the scene and just thought about what that would be like a little bit, what I'd like to do, though, to just sort of go back to the question that we're thinking about at the start, is just to think, how can we learn from this? How can we learn from Jesus' protest, from the protest he makes and the way that he makes it? Well, here's what I think we can learn from this protest if we just sort of break it down and look through it. First of all, Jesus recognised, so if you want points, there's 7 wee thoughts here. First one is, Jesus recognised that something was wrong. Okay, Jesus recognised something was wrong. Now this might seem like a really simple point to make, but it's not. It's not. Jesus walked into a situation that had been going on for years. The temple authorities had raised no issue with it, with having a marketplace within the temple grounds, and in fact they were probably making a pretty penny off it, receiving a handsome income from it. And everyone who had attended the temple had grown used to the spectacle of this marketplace on the Temple Mount. It's a bit like if you go to, some historic monument and there's these stalls with all these tourist knickknacks with the prices jacked up because, people are on location there and that's their chance to buy this thing. It's a bit like that. It just people got used to this being part of the trappings of the temple, that there's these stalls just at jacked up prices about here. It was just there. Yet Jesus was able to discern that this status quo that was accepted by so many, that it was actually at fault. So just because everyone else had grown used to it, just because it was going on and it had been like that for years, doesn't mean it's okay. Doesn't mean it's okay. And Jesus was able to just target and zero in and recognise that. And that's not always easy to do. Sometimes we become blinded by familiarity. We become blinded even to our own moral compass by familiarity with the status quo, with the way that things just are. Yet Jesus' close relationship to God, the indwelling presence of God's Holy Spirit in his life and his awareness of God's word and God's teaching helped him to discern that something was not right with the practice that went on in that place at that time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Jesus took time to thoroughly examine the issue. In Mark's Gospel, verse 11 of chapter 11, we're told there that he looked around at everything. Okay, Jesus looked around at everything. I think that's important. That's important just to pick up on. Jesus didn't jump to a faulty conclusion based on incomplete research from one unreferenced news source without fact checking. Jesus didn't just respond and act based on a random fact shared on Facebook without any context. Jesus took time to fully understand the issue before him. And I think this is something that is so important for all of us to do before we launch into things, that we just make sure we actually properly understand the issues and what the situation is. So the third thing is Jesus therefore, based on fully understanding things, he didn't have a knee-jerk reaction. Again, this might seem like a very small point, but according to Mark's Gospel, Jesus looked around at everything. He took it all in. He made himself fully informed. And then what did he do? He went home for a good night's sleep. He slept on it. And I just wonder how many rash actions born out of emotion would be averted if we all followed this example. Okay, just the fourth little thing there is that Jesus knew what should be. Jesus knew what should be. And let me just explain that one as well. You know, it's so easy to criticize. It's so easy to tear down, to pull holes in the actions and the behaviors of others or in the system around us. It's so easy to do that. But what's often so much harder is to come up with a positive and constructive alternative to work towards. You know, Jesus didn't just call out those who were a den of robbers. He also presented a more positive vision, something else that he was calling people back to what the temple should originally have be for. He's saying, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." He says that's the goal. That's what this place should be. He didn't just say, "Oh, this is terrible." He said, "Look, this is what should be. Let's work towards that." Jesus knew what should be. And the fifth thing here, it's a kind of basic one, is Jesus took action. Jesus took action. He didn't just tut or shake his head from afar. He rolled up his sleeves and he took on the issue, seeking to do what he could to bring about change. That's what Jesus did. And this is such an important part of any protest. Don't just recognize the problem, don't just understand the problem, but seek to do something about the problem. Okay, so at number 6, Jesus focused his actions on the problem. Jesus focused his actions on the problem. Again, this might seem like just repeating the previous point, but let me just unpack that a little bit. Jesus didn't drive out everyone from the temple. He didn't tar everyone with the same brush. He didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Jesus went after the money changers and the traders who were robbing people blind. Yes, Jesus was angry, but he targeted his protest towards the actual problem. Okay, and the last point, point 7 here, and this is a really, really important one, is that Jesus stood up for what he believed in. Jesus stood up for what he believed in. As we can see from Mark's Gospel, Jesus' actions gained him the ire of the religious leaders who went on to plot to kill him. But he stood up for what he believed in, no matter and irrespective of the consequences. And this is an inspiring example. And it's an example that we should challenge ourselves with, particularly if we hold ourselves to be followers of Jesus, where we want to become more like Jesus. We want to act in the way that Jesus acts. We want to think in the way that Jesus thinks, because if we believe that Jesus is a representative to us of God and his nature and his character, and is the the image of God before us in his nature and his character and all that, then we should seek to want to be like Jesus, to live like Jesus. And I don't mean by wearing sandals and having long hair and a beard and all that. I mean by following out his ethos, his principles, his way of life, and the way that he lived for God and for other people. If we want to live that out, then let's take on board what we're looking at and the way that Jesus worked through this and responded to this situation that he and the way that he did that. So Jesus stood up for what he believed in. Again, this is a really inspiring example. If we had time, we could think about some other stories. You can go and look these up if you don't know about them, but we could think about the story of Rosa Parks, who stood up against racial segregation, no matter the cost that she might have incurred because of that. We could think about Richard Wurmbrand, who stood up against Christian subservience to communism, and no matter the cost that brought upon him personally, ended up in prison for a prolonged period of time. We can think about, or we could think about Oscar Romero, who stood up for social injustice, for poverty, and against torture and assassinations that were going on in El Salvador in his day, and doing that no matter the danger, no matter the cost. Or we could think about many other people who've stood up for what they believed in, no matter the cost, no matter the potential repercussions that there could be. And maybe we can learn from this. But Jesus, like these other people we mentioned there, he stood up for what he believed in, no matter the cost, no matter that really him on this temple ground, this temple property, standing up in this way and saying, look, this is not right. That gained him just by the sheer fact that the temple authorities there, it just really got their goat that he was doing this on their turf as they saw it, and they went for him after that. So that's what Jesus did, and he stood up for what he believed in. And maybe we can learn from all this. Maybe we can learn from all this. What would Jesus do if he was in your shoes? It's not always an easy thing to answer, but how can we live out like Jesus? That's a great question, and what we need to do often is to look at, well, what would be the nature of Jesus? How would he respond towards a situation that I'm facing, that maybe our culture or society or community is facing at this time and in particular situations? So it sort of in conclusion, I want to say this: Jesus was a protester. He spoke up for the marginalized by his actions, which in his day were women and children. He spoke against the religious legalism of his day by flouting convention. He took practical action against unjust profiteering in the temple courts, which had gone unchecked by the authorities. But most importantly, and I just finished with this, most importantly, Jesus protested based on his view and his understanding of God and God's intention for his world and for the people that he'd created and whom he loved. Jesus protested based on his love of God, his understanding of God, and how God viewed things. And I think that's really important. So my prayer for each one of us is that we would have convictions like Jesus, to see the world as God sees it, to think deeply and prayerfully, and to work towards making that a reality, to set an example of love and of justice, and to be brave and bold in our actions as we seek to follow God in this way. Okay, amen. We'll leave it there, and thanks for watching, listening, and if you want to learn more about our church, arbothmission.org will help you out. Okay, see you next time.